Good evening, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Rohini Gupta with the Howard County Library System. And today we will be talking about tips for choosing a moving company wisely. And I would like to welcome Tracy Rezvani, who is the administrator with the Office of Consumer Protection, and Louis Campion, who is the president and CEO of the Maryland Motor Truck Association. Thank you so much for being here today and answering all of our questions and sharing information on how to move safely and without any hassles. Thank you and welcome. This event is being recorded and will be available on the library's YouTube channel, as well as the Office of Consumer Protection's channel. And if you have any questions, we would request that you hold them to the end. They will be addressed towards the end. However, feel free to put them in the Q&A box or the comment box, and you don't have to wait for it. As the question occurs to you, please share it, but they will be addressed towards the end of the presentation. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Louis.
Thank you.
All right, well, a great big thank you to the Howard County Public Library System and to you, Louis, for coming on this evening to do this program. You had mentioned earlier, which I hadn't known, is actually May is National Moving Month. So this is actually a perfect time to do this program. Ordinarily, we do PowerPoint presentations, and for the audience, we thought we would maybe change it up a little bit and just do a conversation, a Q&A, an interview, and hope that that would be a little more interesting and would grab attention and be more entertaining. As Louis and I were creating this program, at the forefront was the notion that we're going into the hot moving season, and from our side, we don't hear about the good moves, right? We hear about the moves that go awry, the ones where the movers don't show up, they show up late, they don't come with the right number of people, the right size truck, or once they load up everything onto the truck, they double or triple the price. So with that in mind, we thought this would be a good opportunity to create basically a timeline, a step-by-step guide as to what you need to know at each step of the way so that you can plan and execute your move successfully. So I don't know, Louis, if you wanted to say a couple of things before we get started, or we could go right into it.
No, I just think that thank you for the opportunity to talk to you and talk about this important issue. As you've already noted, we're really getting ready to enter the busy summer moving season. Moving is a very stressful time in people's life. And, most people don't move often. And so to your point, Tracy, because of that, understanding the steps that you can take, providing you with some tips on how to identify a reputable moving company, I think really will allow you to do that research on the front end so that you have ideally as smooth a move as possible.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go into sort of the pre-move logistics, right? So let's say I'm ready to move, move into a new city in the state, out of the state for whatever reason. So before I even begin looking for a moving company, what should I do to make my move as hassle-free as possible?
Yeah, well, I think, you need to make sure you identify what it is you actually intend to take with you, right? So downsizing, decluttering, inventorying the things that you do plan to take, and then getting rid of everything that you don't plan to take, right? Because you don't want to pay for something that you really don't want or really don't need. There are cases all the time of people who planned to get rid of things and the like, but they ended up not doing that. And then on moving day, they find themselves sort of running out of time and they have nowhere to go but to get rid of these things because they've got to get them out of their house. So, the more services you want a mover to provide, obviously, the more the cost is going to be, right? So the first step is to really understand, what is it that you plan to move with you? That's the simplest thing. After you've done that, you really want to look at, again, what services do I expect from the moving company? And there are a variety of services, right? You can have a moving company simply show up at your door and you have packed everything. And there is some concern, if you do that, you should understand the liability that you're taking on if you pack everything. You can have the mover do a full pack of all of your goods, obviously. Are you going to require storage services for any period of time? Do you only want the mover to pack certain items, like high value items like china or mirrors, things that are, potentially damaged? So, that really is the next step. Once you have identified what I want to move, now what services do I want the mover to provide? Because as you start to research that moving company or companies, and you start to look at things like getting estimates, for example, you want to make sure that you're consistent in what you're offering to the mover that you're going to do and that you want, so you can compare those estimates and know that you're getting the same service for the quoted price.
Okay. All right. So I've decluttered. I've taken an inventory. And so where do I start in finding a good moving company?
So that's a great question. And I really encourage people to do that front end research, right? Our organization has, dozens of very reputable moving companies who have been around a long time and who are here to provide a fair service for a fair price. The BBB is an excellent resource for moving companies. They will track complaints, whether or not those complaints have been resolved. You can contact the Attorney General's office. Similarly, they do keep a record of consumer complaints against moving companies and what the nature of those complaints are, right? So obviously OCP, right, certainly is a resource. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration regulates any mover that performs interstate moves. So even if you're moving locally, it's still worth going to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, which is part of the U.S. Department of Transportation, and researching the company, because that company, while you may be moving locally, I guarantee that at some point in time, that company probably performed interstate moves as well. And so you can check the safety record of that company. You can make sure that their license is current and the like. And so, those are great agency opportunities. Referrals are certainly very valuable. If you know someone who has had a very good experience with a mover, then you can probably trust that they're not going to be in business to scam you. If I can offer a caution, as you start to look to, finding moving companies, one of the things we've all gotten really accustomed to doing everything online or on our phone, for example. And, you can easily, like many other industries, go in and not know that you are essentially subscribing to a lead service or a broker, right? And what happens then is, before you know it, you're going to get dozens of calls from moving companies that have essentially paid for those leads, or brokers who are in the business of booking moves, but not actually completing moves, right? Those brokers typically don't have trucks of their own, and you hire them thinking that their promises are honest, which they may be, but also you've really got to beware of brokers, because you don't actually know the moving company who's going to show up at your door on moving day. And ultimately, that's a company that you haven't researched, that you haven't done that exploratory, component, so that you know how good they actually will be.
Right. And for those that are watching, lead generators and brokers, you're going to find in more than just the moving industry. We see them in locksmith and appliance repair. So this is
Absolutely. They're taking over a number of different industries. But again,
Mhm.
yeah, you want to make sure that the company you hire is the company that you researched.
right. So I've got a few companies now. I've researched them and I'm ready to meet with them. How many folks should I meet with and how should I meet them? Online or in person?
So, we recommend 3 estimates when you're seeking a moving company. Beyond 3, it does get very cumbersome for you as the consumer typically to remember them. Right? We're going through a process here in my own office where we're interviewing some IT professionals. And once you get past 3, it gets very difficult to remember and keep all of those things straight. But you want to get 3, because if I only get 2 estimates or only 1 estimate, I will not know whether or not one of those estimates is outside sort of normal pricing, right? If I get 3 estimates, I can compare them all. I might have one that's slightly higher. I might have 2 that are fairly consistent. I might have one that's much lower. And the reality is it costs virtually the same to operate a moving truck, right? The costs don't go down significantly from company to company. And so, that gives you an opportunity to compare those estimates. Did I find one that was unusually high or unusually low, which should create a red flag for me that they're either those services that I'm asking the mover to provide are different. What they're quoting me on is different. Maybe it doesn't include packing. Maybe it's a binding versus a non-binding estimate, for example. So, those are things you want to be very cautious about. You mentioned, Tracy, about the idea of how should you get those estimates, right?
Right.
There was a time when we always recommended getting an in-home estimate, right? And I think that that's still your safest option. There are instances when moving companies will not come to your home, particularly if the move is very small. Then, because they're bringing that salesperson out. And with technology, we've certainly become much more accustomed to being able to use technology to conduct an estimate. The federal government now even changed its regulations around when a virtual estimate is allowed. And during the pandemic, a lot of people were very cautious about having people come to their home. And so we've seen more virtual estimates now. I think the key is you want to make sure that there's eyes on what's going to be moved, whether that be virtually through, one of the various technologies like we're using now, or in person, ideally in person, but there are some circumstances now where, that may or may not be able to occur. So
Yeah, we've seen folks that have got an estimate based on square footage of the home, which is never a good idea because you could be someone who has very little because you like to have a lot of open space, or you might be someone who likes to have at least 3 things hanging off of every wall. So
yeah.
the square footage is not the best way to have a reliable estimate.
No, absolutely. And the reputable companies, they want to give you as accurate an estimate as possible, right? It avoids a problem down the road where you either have an unsatisfied customer or an issue that you have to address later, maybe because the estimate didn't come out accurately. So, again, eyes on the goods one way or the other, whether that be virtually or in person.
Okay. And then when we're evaluating these movers, is there any kind of credentials that they should have, whether from federal, state, or local entities?
Sure. So there actually are a few different credentials. And, the first and foremost is the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, which is the agency that governs all interstate movers. They have a website at protectyourmove.gov where you can do research on that company, certainly. We've talked about, for example, the AG's office, consumer protection, and the like. But In Maryland, we actually are what's considered an unregulated state because we don't have a registration requirement or pricing tariffs for moves that occur entirely within the state of Maryland. We actually do have a law that has passed in Maryland to require registration of household goods movers that our industry supported to make it easier for consumers to go and identify, does a mover have workers' compensation? Does a mover have, cargo and liability insurance and all of these things that you would expect? Unfortunately, so far, the Department of Labor hasn't implemented that regulation. We do expect it to come soon, but to that end, it can be difficult in a state like Maryland because we don't regulate movers through registration and licensing currently to find out that if that mover is reputable. Most of those regulations really stem around the fact that a mover is running a truck. Right. So you have to have a DOT, what's a Department of Transportation issued number, either from the federal government or from the state of Maryland, for example. And then there are a number of rules and regulations that have to be followed because they're running that truck. But, it certainly can be difficult. Because of the absence of a licensing program in Maryland that the government runs, we actually have our own program. It's very select. It has about 15 or 16 of our member moving companies who have chosen to voluntarily go through a registration program that we created. They're the only movers who are listed on our website, actually, at mdmovers.org. And what those movers do is they agree to follow a code of ethics, a statement of policy, an arbitration system that is run either through the BBB or the American Arbitration Association to resolve disputes. For example, they have to submit all of their documents, their bills of lading, their terms and conditions, for example, their contracts to us for review, and we validate that they're in legal compliance with the rules that Maryland does have in place, so that they can hold themselves out as, wanting to adhere to a higher standard.
Okay, good. That's thank you. So one of the words that I've heard, that we've heard estimates, we've heard contract, we've heard bills of lading. What's the difference between all that? And you've also mentioned binding versus non-binding. So I think the viewers would be interested to learn what is it that they need to make sure they have in writing, and what should be in the contract, whether it's called a contract or a bill of lading.
Sure. So, yep, and that bill of lading is the contract. You're absolutely correct. So first understand that your estimate is not your contract, right? So if that salesperson comes to your house, or if they've performed a virtual estimate, that is not your final contract, right? They are basing a price on what you have shown them and what services you have identified that you want. That can change, obviously. You might decide to modify that up until the day of your move. It's actually on the day of your move that you will sign essentially a contract. Your estimate, though, can be binding or non-binding, right? A binding estimate assures you as a customer that the move for the services that are identified in it will not exceed that amount. So if the binding estimate suggests that the move is going to cost $1,000, you don't change the services that you require, then that move cannot exceed $1,000. Typically, you will pay more for a binding estimate because the mover is also trying to protect themselves against something that might occur, and they want to make sure that, we're all agreeing that this is a fair service for a fair price, but they want to be cautious as well. And so there normally is a slight premium for a binding estimate because you get that assurance, right? A non-binding estimate is exactly what it sounds like, that they're saying that this is the price we believe this move will cost you. But most local moves or intrastate moves are based on time and materials, right? You have weight-based shipments frequently on the interstate side across state lines, but time and materials often hourly for local or intrastate moves. There are things outside of a mover's control, such as inclement weather, such as if you're moving into a neighborhood and the moving via truck, based on the size of your move, is a tractor trailer, and that move cannot be made based on your neighborhood access. Meaning the tractor trailer doesn't fit, right? So in those circumstances, you might have to have something called shuttle service, which means then the moving company has to bring in smaller vans to basically bring your goods in. So to that end, Maryland does have some protections on non-binding estimates for the services, again, identified in the estimate. That was something that we supported, that a Maryland mover cannot charge you more than 125% of the non-binding estimate for those services. If you add services, they would have to write an addendum to your contract to include those additional services, but they cannot charge you more than 125% for those services. So, when you hear these stories of hostage loads and shipments where movers are jacking up prices 2 and 3 times, one, that's illegal already in the state of Maryland. But 2, your estimate, there's a limitation that movers have to follow relative to that.
Yes, and we'll be talking about the hostage and the hijacking of stuff later in the hour. So what should I make sure is included in that contract so that I am protected before, during, and after the move?
Sure. So you want to make sure that it clearly identifies, what is to be moved. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to have an inventory of every single item, right? In fact, on local moves, typically you will not have an inventory unless those moves involve storage. If your goods are going into storage, that mover will walk through every item in your house and identify what is to be moved, what is to go into storage, and they'll document if there is any damage to those items, right? So you want to make sure that items that may be scratched, in less than ideal condition, all of that should be documented either by you or the mover jointly, because they want to protect themselves also in claims that perhaps, they damaged something that in fact they may not have. Mm-hmm. That needs to be in writing, right? And there are rules in Maryland around what kind of receipts you're entitled to. For example, what must be provided in a written receipt that a mover has to give to you. You want to make sure that if you have items that are excluded from the move, that is clearly documented as well. And you also want to be really cautious about, certain high value items. Either you taking photos, the mover will often take photos of those high value items on the front end as well, because, they want to make sure that they're getting that one, the good actually was released in their possession, and 2, what is the condition of the good? Again, a protection for everyone, right? So, that's a really important thing. And I can't caution you enough, if you have small, high dollar items, things like jewelry, those types of things, you should move those yourself, right? So that you don't run the risk of either loss, damage, or theft. Right, any number of those things that could potentially occur. A mover will actually ask you to declare what's a high value item on a separate inventory, even if they're doing a local move where they don't inventory all of your goods because you're not going into storage. Hey, I'm just following the truck from my house to my new house, right? And so I know that they're in possession the entire time. High value items should be documented. It protects everyone. So that's declared right up front. So, there are a number of things you want to be really careful about. What is the delivery time, right? I'm sure you guys get frequent complaints about movers not arriving either on the certain date or on a certain time. On interstate shipments, for example, the delivery date is going to be a window typically, because if you can imagine, if you're moving from here to California, somebody, unless you have a full tractor trailer worth of goods that will, fill that entire vehicle, the mover is likely to piggyback your move with someone else's goods too, because it costs them a lot to travel that far and to operate that vehicle. So what normally will happen on those types of shipments is there will be a delivery window. It might be 7 days, within a 7-day period, that they guarantee that your goods will arrive. So just make sure that you're looking really carefully at your contract, that it does specify the date, it does specify the time. We haven't talked yet about valuation and insurance coverage that in effect you have for your goods, which is really important to understand in your contract.
Yeah, I was going to ask about insurance.
Yeah.
The one thing I will say is, in addition to jewelry, make sure you're taking your own prescriptions.
Absolutely.
Because if that gets lost, that's a whole problem. And then the other thing that I've seen a lot of is where the pitch is, I'll have 4 people come for your move, but on the day of, only 2 show up. Is that something that typically could also go in the contract? How many people will
Well, it should specify the hourly rate. Like if you're moving locally, it will specify the hourly rate, and you should ask for how many people is included in that service, right? That I can certainly imagine scenarios where movers, particularly during the busy summer season, right, are really jammed up, and they start to look at how many men can I provide? Am I able to get by with less labor? So you should make sure that that is included, because it's going to impact the number of hours that the move takes, which ultimately impacts your price.
Right. All right. So let's get to insurance, which you mentioned, what's available, what's best, what should folks consider when they are looking at a move?
Yeah. So, there are, I caution using the word insurance, and I use it myself because insurance is sold by a licensed insurance agent, right? Moving companies can offer you true insurance, but it does require, with a certificate of insurance and the like, but it does require that it's issued by an actual insurance broker in Maryland and the like. What movers do is they offer something called valuation, and it functions a lot like insurance in that it is a level of protection that you are paying for loss or damage of your goods, right? There are typically 2 most common levels of valuation. One is what they call standard valuation. There's no minimum requirement in Maryland on what standard valuation looks like. The federal government requires on an interstate shipment that it's 60 cents per pound. So a lot of movers will mirror what they offer on interstate shipments on local moves and offer 60 cents per pound. I have seen numbers that are as low as 30 cents per pound. And so let me give you some context of what that means. That's frequently offered at no additional charge, or it's built into whatever the quote is in your move. Imagine that you had a 100-pound refrigerator, and that refrigerator gets completely destroyed in your move. At 30 cents per pound, you're going to get $30 for your refrigerator. Oftentimes people, do cut costs by only taking the standard valuation, but they have to understand that that is a level of risk that they're assuming, and they're only going to get that minimum dollar amount for those items. Or you have something that may be a high value, piece of furniture that's 25 pounds, and that might have been $1,000 piece of furniture, but you do the math on that and, you're suddenly getting minimal dollars. So you really have to understand that level of protection. The federal government actually mandates that unless you choose standard valuation, then you automatically get what's called full replacement valuation. Full replacement valuation is the best level of protection you can get. It does come with deductible options, so you can select a deductible. It does come with an additional charge based on your deductible, based on the total value of goods. So, for example, if I suggest that my goods combined are worth $100,000, right? I can get full replacement valuation for up to $100,000. It also prevents me from filing a claim for more than $100,000 if that truck is entirely destroyed. But then, it also says, let's take that 100-pound refrigerator that we talked about. What happens with full replacement valuation, if that refrigerator is damaged, the mover will either repair to its condition when it was moved, or restore it, or replace it. Right. There is a depreciation based on the age of the good, but it is the best protection you can have from a moving company, and making sure that your goods are adequately protected and that you're compensated in the event that you do have damages.
And we get quite a number of complaints, and a lot of our consumers are surprised to find that they had gotten the standard and not the full replacement policy.
Yeah.
So definitely something to discuss with any mover you're looking to hire.
Yeah.
Are there other policies that might cover homeowners, renters? Do we need to even worry about workers' compensation with folks coming onto our property?
Nope. Great question. So, the homeowners policy is going to vary. For some policies do cover damages and some do not cover damages. You should, though, make sure that your mover has workers' compensation, right? Because you are potentially liable if a mover is injured on your property while performing that move, if they can't demonstrate that they have workers' compensation. Traditionally, they can provide that to you in the form of a certificate of insurance, so you can validate who is their workers' compensation carrier, right? That mover should also have mover's liability insurance, right? And that's going to protect you in the event that there's damage to your property, meaning your home, right? So we talked about damages, for example, to your goods through valuation, the things that you're moving. Valuation doesn't protect things like, hey, they accidentally scraped my floor or damaged my wall, for example. That's covered under the mover's liability policy. You don't pay extra for that, but you want to make sure that they have it, right? So that way they can essentially pay to cover those damages should they occur.
Got it. I just want to provide some tips, because this does go beyond MMTA's work. But if you are doing the move to storage, there's an extra layer of research that you should do to make sure that the storage warehouse has the right license and it is a warehouse rather than, a barn or something. You want to make sure you've inspected the warehouse. If you're paying extra for any kind of climate control, that it actually exists and is working. Nothing is worse than getting your goods back covered in mold. And then, see what insurance options are there, so that if something does go wrong, that you do have the insurance, the storage insurance, to be able to cover that piece of it. So that's just a side note on if you are doing a partial or a move to storage in full for any reason, maybe you're being deployed, or if you're doing a partial.
And
all right, go ahead.
Sorry. Just no, you're absolutely right. Just to sort of piggyback on that. So it is not uncommon at all for potential customers to ask to see a moving company's storage warehouse. So you shouldn't feel timid about making that request when you're considering a mover, for all the reasons you noted. What is the condition of it? How clean is it? Does it actually exist? Right? We have seen instances where companies that promise to provide storage services and claim that they have a warehouse are really just putting your goods in self-storage. So you should be able to go and see that warehouse if you're considering hiring.
Yeah, any addresses that you get, whether it's on the estimate, the contract, do a search on Maps or Google Earth and look at it. If you can't drive to it, take a look at it remotely. Make sure it's a real location. A lot of addresses are going to PO boxes, UPS stores, executive suites, that kind of thing. And so there's not going to be a facility there. That's just a mail drop. And so you want to make sure that you are confident that you can find your mover for any post-move needs and be able to maybe walk into a location. All right, so we've now arrived at moving day, right? We're all frazzled, we're exhausted, we've managed to pack unless we pay the packers. And we here at OCP get a lot of complaints about the moving day. And these I am not making up. It includes that the wrong truck size arrives, or it's a U-Haul truck and not the truck that they thought they were going to get. They don't have tools to disassemble the furniture. The right number of people haven't shown up. They try to deliver everything to the garage and not actually put it into the house. One of the employees is drunk and is stealing the liquor. The mover may be hitting on the female consumer. And maybe the person who showed up with the U-Haul has hired day labor that is folks that are not experienced movers. These are all real life examples. I cannot make these up. What can I do if that happens to me right on the spot on moving day? I'm kind of stuck, but what can I do?
You are, honestly, you are kind of stuck. It's a really difficult scenario. It really illustrates the importance of doing the research on the front end to make sure the company you hire is a reputable one. Certainly you can call the office of the company to complain, assuming you get an answer there, right? And, there are times when law enforcement have been called to the scene of moving disputes. One of the challenges from a law enforcement side is that they generally view this as a civil issue, right? And so they often aren't able to intervene. So unless you have a safety concern, for example, some of the issues that you've mentioned, that's going to be a really difficult item to try and address through law enforcement. And if you've got a mover who's not reputable already, and you're experiencing some of those things, that is a very difficult thing to try and get out of on moving day. You're turning your whole life over to these guys. Your life is on that truck. And that's why you've got to do that research on the front end. One of the things that we've seen that has really escalated, some of these instances is because people are so accustomed, particularly younger generations, with wanting to do everything on their phone, right? They want to book their move on their phone. They don't care if the mover comes out. Moving isn't like ordering a pizza, right? And so the reality is that you've got to do that research on the front end to give yourself the best chance for a successful move. Because it's often too late when either the mover is in your home or worse, they're driving off in the truck with all of your things.
So when and how should I pay for the move? And the how is really, I'm thinking check, credit card, cash, payment app. But like, when should I relinquish the funds and how is the safest to pay?
So to me, the safest mechanism is still credit card. right? And now I will say there was a time when we said that movers typically did not take deposits, that reputable movers typically did not require deposits. That has changed over the years. So what I'll say is that a mover shouldn't require an exorbitant deposit, right? They may ask you to put a portion down, a flat amount down to secure the move, but overwhelmingly, a mover who asks you to put a large sum of money up front, or worse yet, to do that in cash, right, is probably not someone that you want to hire. Credit card payments do afford you a protection, certainly, to dispute that payment if there is, some type of reason for dispute.
Yeah, and I will add that payment apps have very little protections. I think folks think that they are safer than they are. And even in cases of outright fraud and scams, we have had incredible difficulty getting any kind of refund back, because once the money is gone, it's gone, and these payment app providers do not want to be left holding the bag. So for that reason, I agree. Credit is king, and make sure it's credit cards, not those debit cards that are tied to your bank account that have a Visa MasterCard logo. While they are, for the most part, are covering the same protections and dispute rights that you get with credit cards, they're not exactly the same, and they don't have to be the same. So keep that in mind. You want a true credit card. Okay, so we're now post-move. I've gotten everything. I followed my diagram. Everything's been put where it goes. What am I going to be asked to sign? And are there any notations that I should be making on what they're asking me to sign?
Yep. So you are going to be asked to sign, essentially acceptance of the goods, that you've received the goods, right? That you will be provided, if the mover is reputable, you will be provided with a receipt that has some specific information regarding the mover's contact information and the like that's required under Maryland law. The thing you need to also understand is you're only going to have a limited amount of time to identify, based on your contract, if anything has been damaged. I know I've moved a few times. It's impossible to identify if anything has been damaged unless it's very obvious, during moving day. So, putting a notation that acknowledges receipt of the goods, but, subject to further inspection for, damages and the like, you can make that notation. And then you want to look really carefully at how many days do you have to file a claim, right? So I've seen them typically in the sort of 2-week range. I've seen variances over that. On interstate shipments, they have a different set of rules there, but understand that you've got to get that documented to the moving company by, if it's 14 days, by day 14. Otherwise, in effect, you've forfeited your right to file a claim after that. And you can see both sides of this, because now that piece of furniture has been in your control for a period of time. If you have decided to move that yourself somewhere else, you don't like where it's been placed, and you then damage it, the moving company needs to protect itself against what I'll call false claims. But also you need time, particularly for items that are boxed, right, where maybe you haven't had a chance to see if anything has been damaged or not, to go through that. So just know that you need to do that promptly.
Okay. So I've woven the concept of scams and schemes throughout my questioning. What is the most prevalent scam, and are you seeing a problem with that in Maryland?
So no, that's really easy. The most prevalent scam that we see is essentially lowball estimates and then holding goods hostage for an increased price, right? 2, 3, 4 times what the estimate indicated. And that's illegal on 2 fronts, right? It's illegal because, as we talked about earlier, they can't charge more than 125% of the estimate for the services that are in the estimate. But 2, in Maryland, it is illegal for a mover to hold a customer's goods hostage. So they have to release the goods to you. They can't threaten to hold the goods hostage or proceed with holding the goods hostage under threat of payment, right? So that is the biggest challenge in my mind when a moving company is taking an action like that, where they're demanding excess payment and they're holding your goods and refusing to relinquish them. That is a theft issue. Unfortunately, we haven't convinced law enforcement that that's the case because they're still viewing that as a contract dispute, even though that is a violation in Maryland law. And I would say that because of the discussion we had earlier about internet bookings, that we have seen really in the last 10 to 20 years, large increases in those types of scams, because if you can imagine pre-internet, movers were really limited in how they advertised, right? The most common form of advertising was Yellow Pages, right? Which was very geocentric. I'm advertising in the area that I serve. Now, with the internet, I can advertise to millions of people, honestly, around the globe, right? Just by putting up a nice website, giving the appearance that I'm a very professional mover. You'll commonly see movers that use name variations of legitimate movers. So, to name one of the most, famous van lines in the country is United Van Lines or Mayflower Van Lines, right? Or North American Van Lines. These are very reputable organizations. So what you might see is, I heard of a company one time that was called United American Van Lines. So they start to build off of company names that they know are reputable in the hopes that you'll believe that you're hiring a reputable company.
So, and the reason I obviously hear about them is because the complaints get filed, but other than filing a complaint with us, where else could consumers go to file a complaint to be able to, at this point, consumers end up paying the exorbitant price because they need to get their materials. How do we go about getting the money back? Obviously, if the move is happening within Howard County, we're a resource. If it's outside of the county, within the state, across state lines, what are some resources for consumers?
Yep. So, certainly the court option is one that is available, particularly if you don't have your goods or those goods were mistreated and there are a lot of excess damages, for example, for which you cannot seem to get resolution, with the moving company. We talked about the BBB earlier, right? The BBB tracks consumer complaints. They arbitrate disputes. We actually keep our own list of moving company complaints because we get consumers who do reach out to us on the front end. And whenever somebody calls me on the front end, I'm thrilled. And they ask, have you ever heard of this company, or not? Do you have any complaints against them? And so we're able to just say, yes or no, we know this company. Here are the nature of complaints that we may have had against them. The Attorney General's office is an excellent resource as well. They absolutely track consumer complaints. We talked about the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Those are the types of things that if you're running a truck, if FMCSA shuts down your operating authority, that's going to really open a scam mover up to enforcement when they pass a scale house, for example, if they're pulled over by law enforcement for any reason, things of that nature that can, rein them in. the challenge oftentimes with complaints is, sadly, if people contact me and they tell me they had to pay an excess amount for their move, but they got their goods, I view that positively, because it's too often that we hear stories of, I don't know where my things are, the mover has left, and everything I own is gone. Right. So again, reinforcing that research on the front end is such a key factor. And the reality, unfortunately, is that from an enforcement standpoint, agencies like FMCSA have very few investigators who have to cover the entire country. So it's not as if someone is going to show up at your door while you're in a dispute with that mover to try and assist you. That is not going to occur, and that's why you've got to be smarter on the front end. Unfortunately, it requires a number of consumers to make complaints to organizations like yours at OCP, to the AG's office, right? So that we put companies that are scam artists out of business so they can't keep taking advantage of consumers and really, leave moving to the legitimate moving industry.
All right. Well, this has been a terrific program. Thank you, Louis, for all of the information. We do have questions that I've seen pop up. Rohini, do you want me to read them? I'm not sure I'm seeing them all.
Okay, a question we have here is, how do we handle a situation where the long tractor trailer with multiple families' items doesn't fit neatly in the move area and the mover tacks on an additional fee, especially since parking near townhomes can be a challenge depending on the time of the day? And,
Yep.
and that's a question you cannot answer, because when you're moving to a new area, you don't really know if it's going to be an issue or not, or what the rules are.
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, it is one that is very uncertain, right? Because neither the mover nor the consumer can often predict whether or not that will be necessary. So you do need to ask your mover on the front end with your estimate, for example, what is included in this? What happens if I might need shuttle service? The good thing is that technology, as bad as it is for making people want to book a move really easy, it also opens up opportunities to really explore the visibility of a location, both by the moving company and by the consumer in advance, to identify if there's a potential problem. Similar type of thing around, if you have the need for a freight elevator, if you're moving to a high rise or apartment complex or something that requires that, those are types of things that can add cost to the move. So doing as much as you can kind of on the front end to validate what's included in your contract from a service standpoint, and then trying to identify where there may be potential problems is key.
Thank you so much. We have another question that was asking, in your estimate from the mover, what is specifically included? Is it by distance, the boxes, loading, unloading?
Yep. So that's another great question. And that is going to vary by mover, and why it's so important for you to look at that estimate and ask questions of the person who's providing it to you. In some cases, the mover may allocate some boxes at no additional charge, but frequently there are charges for boxes, for packing supplies, for materials that are used. And so you want to know what all is included in this estimate, how many boxes of certain sizes, because that will be specified in many cases. For example, they have boxes called wardrobe units. Those types of boxes come with a price associated with them. So you want to know what boxes are included in this estimate, and that should be spelled out and what the charges are for each of those. So if you exceed them, that that there might be additional price, or if you don't need them, that you're not paying for something that you may have had in your estimate that you ultimately didn't need or use.
And again, for folks, the protectyourmove.gov is the FMCSA website that really does spell out soup to nuts a lot of what we've been discussing here today. Unless there's any other questions, I think this has been a really, really great program. And again, I'd like to thank Rohini and Howard County Public Libraries, Lewis Campion, for giving us an hour of your evening. And I see there was something popped up on, oh, here's a Q&A. Does a move over a state line automatically cost more, even if it's a short distance? I think we need to talk about that DMV exception a little bit if we have the time.
Yeah, sure. So the answer to that is no. You know, in many cases, the charge will be based differently. So frequently, you know, local or intrastate moves are time and material based moves. Interstate moves are typically charged based on a combination of weight and distance. So moving over state lines, but not a far distance, doesn't necessarily mean that you'll pay more than a move that's, you know, intrastate, but could be 3 hours away, and the like. So the one thing that Tracy's alluding to is there is something called the commercial zone, and the commercial zone is a radius in all around the country. We have one here. It's called the DC commercial zone. It includes Northern Virginia and portions of Maryland. And if you're moving entirely within the commercial zone, all rules go out the window. So if Virginia has rules that govern, you know, Virginia moves, they don't matter. If Maryland has moves that govern Maryland moves, they don't matter. The feds don't take jurisdiction on moves that occur in the commercial zone. And again, there are commercial zones all around the country, particularly in areas where there are high populations near state borders. Right. So you want to be really careful if you're moving in the commercial zone, and make sure that you are finding a mover who is highly regarded, who is, you know, has appropriate operating authority with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, and doing that research on the front end. There are a lot of great moving companies out there. Tracy said it at the beginning, right? There are so many good moves, but it's the bad ones that we hear about and that resonate. And it's the bad ones that, you know, people walk away potentially losing, you know, belongings that they've had a lifetime acquiring. So doing that research on the front end will provide you with some assurances that whether you're moving across state lines in Maryland or just in the same town, that you've selected a mover you can trust.
All right, with that, it's 8:01. And again, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, this has been terrific. And we will have the recording available on the library's channel or website. It'll be on our channel as well. And there's a link to it right on our homepage for all of our consumer protection videos. And again, thank you everybody for this amazing program, and we'll let you sign off.
Thank you so much, Lois. Thank you so much, Tracy. This has been such an informative evening. And thank you for taking all of our questions. And to everybody who joined us today, have a great evening. Have a great rest of your evening. And I'll share out the links in a post-event email. Thank you and good night.
Thanks.
All right. Good night. Thank you.